So first I want to talk about inorganic versus organic pigments. Inorganic pigments are those that are made up of the actual substance of the earth. So they're made up of metals, of oxides, of substances that are just ground really finely and made into paint, basically, made into a paste. A good example of that would be burnt umber or raw umber. So this here is actually a red umber. I don't have burnt umber, but it's very similar to burnt umber. It's just a little more red. And then here is raw umber. Now, similar to last time, I'm going to add a bit of white to those colors so you can see them more easily. So umbers and oxides, raw sienna, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, those kinds of colors come from the earth, and they're actually that very substance that is ground and mixed with oil. So those are called inorganic pigments. Organic pigments are more like dyes. So they're based on carbon compounds, like organic chemistry, which is where the name comes from. Sometimes they're very old and have been used for centuries, and other times they might be very modern. It can be a bit deceiving, the terms organic and inorganic, because often we think of organic as being from the earth, whereas the inorganic ones are actually the ones technically from the earth. But again, we're thinking in terms of organic chemistry and carbon, which is a bit beyond my realm of knowledge here, but that's why it's called organic. So what does this actually mean in a practical way? Generally, inorganic materials, those from the earth that are the actual substance, tend to be grittier. Like you can actually feel the particles because they're much bigger. They're bigger particles. They tend to be opaque, and they tend to lose their chroma really easily when mixed with white. So take a look at both of these colors that I've mixed with white, the red umber and the raw umber. Look at how the white has really brought down the chroma. So it's quite a bit grayer than the pure pigment. So oxides like transparent red oxide would be considered an inorganic pigment as well. And this one's fairly high chroma. Another example would be raw sienna. I don't know if you can hear, but it's gritty when you mix it. You can kind of feel that when mixing the paint. So raw sienna, burnt sienna, all those kinds of things would be inorganic. Generally, like I said, they're opaque. They're usually lower chroma. They really tend to lose their chroma when mixed with white. And they're very stable. They retain their color because the color is actually a substance. It's not a dye or an ink or something that would fade over time. One notable exception is ultramarine blue. So ultramarine blue is actually an inorganic pigment, but it's very high chroma, it's transparent, and it tends to retain its chroma really nicely when mixed with white. So there are always exceptions. It's not, their behavior is not a rule. And I think it's important to know that too. Organic pigments are generally dyes or kind of a similar substance. A good example of that would be Indian yellow. Get a bit more. So Indian yellow and most organic pigments will be transparent. They'll be higher chroma, and they will better retain their chroma when mixed with white. So Indian yellow was actually traditionally a dye made from the urine of cows who were fed a diet of mangoes. I don't think that's how they make it anymore. But the color kind of makes sense, eh? So look at how vibrant that is. And notice how the color itself, the pigment when not mixed with white, the color looks quite different. And again, that's because it's a transparent dye. It's like those little thins of food dye that you put into icing or cake or something. They look very concentrated, and it's hard to tell what color they are until you add white to them, which again touches on what we learned in the first lesson, but this is the why of it. Another example of an organic color would be quinacridone red. So again, that one's transparent. It's very high chroma, and it retains its chroma when mixed with white. Phthalo green would be another one. Again, very high chroma, transparent, and retains its chroma. Other examples of inorganic pigments would be cadmiums. So cadmiums are metals, and they're not actually very good for you if you get them on your skin. So an interesting thing with cadmiums is that they are opaque, so they follow that rule. They're usually very high chroma, straight out of the tube. But if you mix them with white, they lose that chroma almost instantly. See that difference? It really grays down. Same kind of idea with, say, cadmium lemon. Oops, I got a bit of cadmium orange mixed in with that, but the same rules will apply. So it really grays down with white. Now, white will generally gray down most colors because it is a gray, but it especially grays down inorganic pigments. Now, there's no better or worse in terms of having inorganic or organic pigments. If you want to have a more traditional palette that old masters would have had, you'll be usually using the inorganic pigments because that's what they had access to, since it was, again, literally those substances from the earth that didn't require too much preparation or manipulation. Organic pigments will give you a wider range of colors, less in that natural range, of course, but sometimes you might sacrifice the light fastness. So light fastness is whether the color retains its color, its chroma, over time when exposed to sunlight. Inorganic pigments tend to be light fast, again, because they're an actual substance, whereas the organic pigments don't always retain their light fastness. So it's important to look at the tube and it'll tell you whether it's light fast or not, and then make decisions accordingly. And for myself, I like using both. I like having this range of organic and inorganic pigments, mostly because I like different opacities. I don't usually use the umbers and the siennas too much, so I probably lean more towards the organic pigments, but I do use cadmiums, and I find them to be really helpful in conjunction with organic pigments because cadmiums are opaque, like I mentioned before. So if you want to change a color, to lighten it, darken it, shift it somehow, without necessarily adding white, it becomes important to have opaque pigments that are also light. For example, let's say I was working with sap green, which is an organic color. It's transparent, and I wanted to lighten it, but I didn't want to use white. I wanted something that made it not quite a pastel or a tint like that. I could take some sap green and, let's say, some cadmium green pale. And see how that lightens it, and it creates a richer green than just adding white. Similarly, I could take permanent crimson and add some cadmium orange to it. And see, I get a lighter, more opaque red that I can control the warmth of the color by adding more orange or less orange, which is a very different look than if I were to take that same permanent crimson and add white. So I like having those opaque paints as options for lightening the organic colors and giving them body too, so we get an opaque result, an opaque mixture. So by experimenting with the colors, adding white to them, mixing them together, you'll get a chance to see how they behave with one another. Visit NicoleSleethAtelier.com to sign up for the full course or become a member to access all content.